Tort is a branch of civil law as opposed to criminal law, which provides a remedy for a wrongfully inflicted injury or loss or for infringement of a protected interest. Tort creates a right on part of the claimant and at the same time imposes a duty or obligation on the defendant not to invade that interest. There are different types of interest protected by law. The first one is physical integrity. Number 2 is interest in property. Number 3 is interest in use and enjoyment of land. And number 4 is reputation. In tort, a monetary sum is given to compensate the claimant for a harm that is inflicted. That is, it puts the claimant in the position he or she would have been in if the wrong had not been done. Sometimes courts order an injunction which can provide a remedy in some tort claims and are most commonly used in torts of nuisance and trespass. An injunction is an order of the court prohibiting a person from doing something or requiring a person to do something. There are mainly two mechanisms for compensating innocent victims of actionable injury or loss. There are two main mechanisms for compensating innocent victims of actionable injury or loss. These are known as loss shifting and the other is loss spreading. Loss shifting is where the loss that the innocent claimant suffers is shifted onto the defendant by forcing the defendant to pay the claimant the damages. Loss spreading as a principle of compensation expresses the idea of so-called distributive justice, the spreading of losses among a number of people. Let's now ponder upon the defining characteristics of tort law. Tort shares certain characteristics found in criminal domain and the other in contract law. Unlike contract law, which seeks to enforce a single obligation, a promise, the wrongs of tort are wide-ranging. Another distinction between contract and tort is that the content of a tortious obligation is fixed by law. For example, if I knock you down by carelessly driving my car, I am liable to compensate you, because the law imposes a duty to drive carefully, and not because I have promised you that I will do so. In contract, it is the parties through their various negotiations that determine the content of a contract. Therefore, breach of a contract involves breach of an obligation voluntarily undertaken by the person who did the breach. So if I fail to deliver the car that you have bought from me, I am liable to compensate you because I failed to carry out my promise. Now let's take a peek at criminal law. Criminal law is the body of law that deals with crime and the legal punishment of injuries to the public. A crime is an offense against the state and the purpose of a sanction is to punish the offender. Tort law, on the other hand, which happens to be a civil law domain, deals with the disputes between individuals, organizations, or between the two in which compensation is awarded to the victim. Tort is not primarily concerned about punishing, and unlike criminal law, it is focused not on the interest of the state, but on the individual victim of a tort. Additionally, the main purpose of criminal law is to maintain the stability of a state and society by punishing the offenders and deterring them and others from defending. While tort's main purpose is to deal with disputes between individuals, in criminal law, it is the jury who decides if the defendant should be convicted if guilty or acquitted if not found guilty. While in tortious claims, it's the judge who decides whether the defendant is found liable or not. In criminal law, the burden of proof is beyond reasonable doubt, while in tort, on the other hand, the burden of proof is the preponderance of the evidence. Lastly, in criminal law, the defendant is innocent until proven guilty. However, in tort, the claimant must give proof. However, the burden may shift to the defendant in situations where the case speaks for itself. For a claim to succeed, the defendant's intentional or careless conduct, on the other hand, must lead to a damage inflicted, that is, loss or either injury, of a kind that is recognizable by tort. People claim to contract diseases as a result of exposure to harmful substances. They claim to suffer economic loss as a result of negligent advice. They claim to suffer psychological or emotional illness as a result of the malicious transmission of information. The types of damages that are recognizable in tort include but are not limited to physical damage to the person or property, psychological damage resulting from physical or the apprehension of physical harm, which is also known as assault, interference with land, and number 4, economic loss. Let's now take a look at the case law. In Jobling versus Associate Diaries, the defendants were liable in negligence when the plaintiff sustained a back injury at his work. The injury led to a 50% reduction in his earning capacity. 3 years later, and before trial of this negligence action, the onset of a disease on the spine left him totally unfit for work. Because the second event was brought about by the natural causes, the House of Lords held that the defendants were only liable for the reduced earning capacity up to the time of the onset of the disease. Before we conclude, let's talk about defects and damages. Let's first unravel the difference between defects and damages. In D&F Estates Limited versus Church Commissioners for England, it was said that the damage is to be given its natural meaning, which is to make a thing worse, while a defect on the other hand meant to create a bad thing. So if as a result of negligent inspection of the foundations on which a property is built, the property becomes weakened and subject to subsidence, it cannot be said that the negligent inspection caused damage to the property in question. Rather, it was a negligent act that resulted in the construction of a defective property. A defect per se is irrecoverable because to allow recovery for a defect in property would be to introduce into the law of tort a non-contractual remedy as to fitness for purpose. Such guarantees are the points of the law of contract and not the law of tort. In the next video, we'll take a look at the negligence under the law of tort and the duties that arise accordingly.